So as we enter the 20th century art, the late 20th century art is what I should be saying, we're going to see a lot of art movements, more so than anything we've seen in past lectures. So what it all sort of gets umbrellaed under, or what it all eventually gets called, is postmodernism. And this postmodernism sort of leads into today's art, which later gets referred to as postmodernism. It's very original, I know, but this is sort of what's happening. Everything gets intertwined, everything gets connected, and art historians don't really know how to label it, how to put it. So there's sort of this conglomeration of all these different names, all these different movements, and to really focus on all these movements at once would be near impossible since they're all intertwined. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to focus on the artists and sort of the artists' timeline rather than the art movements of this time. And the first artist that we're going to look at is Louise Bourgeois. And she comes from Paris, and she was born in 1915 to a domineering father and an ill mother. So her mother was very sick when she gets older. And her father will eventually cheat on her mother with her English tutor. So that's one of the foundations into understanding her artworks. That and the fact that her father wished that she was actually born a son instead of a daughter. And the sort of final cherry on top that ties it all together is her fascination with Freud and psychoanalysis. So we're going to be going into psychoanalysis a little bit, which sort of comes up in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. That's when he starts publishing his works. So she's reading these works, she gets very influenced. But the first piece that we're going to look at isn't so much focused on Freud in the other aspects that she focuses on, but rather it's focusing on herself of the time period. So, Femme Mention, which it was a way of her statement to make a statement on housewives and being a housewife herself. So at this point, she had 3 kids, and she was married, and she moved to America at this point as well. And the female in this is imprisoned in the home as a sort of straitjacket, restricted by expectations and the male gender. And she is convinced that it is protecting her, when in reality she is exposed to the world. So the top half is always covered. She thinks that she's safe. She thinks that she's fine, but all of her bits and parts are out to the world. So she thought of her mother when she was making this, believe it or not, because she thought that her mother was a perfect housewife, a perfect mother. And she herself felt like she was failing and that she could never achieve such perfection. And in thinking of her mother and father, she actually produces another work, Germinal, where one half is actually a breast, and it's to represent her mother, and the other half is phallic sort of references protruding into space to represent her father, and sort of their relationship and their intertwining. So this is not the only time that she combines gender anatomical attributes. She actually does it in the piece Janus Fleury, and she used 2 penises pressed together to suggest the female genitalia. And now, if we look at the name or the title and we just break it apart, Janus actually comes from the Roman god of gates and passageways. He's depicted often with 2 heads, one that sees into the past and others that see into the future. So, as we can see by the work and by the title as to why she would take on such a god of the old. And although it references that god from the Roman time period in the title and sort of in this abstraction, she actually referred to this piece as a self-portrait. So she saw it as a representation of herself and sort of the past and the future self. And actually, another great example of the self-portrait for her is in the work Fillet, which means little girl. So the phallic symbol here is also suggested of the female anatomy. It could be either a little girl in a raincoat with boots, or it could be the neck of a female with the testicles representing her breasts. And this goes back to her past, and it's depicting her father's wishes for her to be a son, yet she cannot escape the reality or the fact that she is a female. And as she sort of digs deeper into her past and representing her past, she does so in the destruction of the father. We see a freeing of the past as the children, or what represents the children, sitting around a table devouring their father. And she used the dining room table for sort of two reasons, or to juxtapose to two things. So to set the stage as she felt, and that was that parents use the dining room table to sort of create suffering for their children. That's kind of what she thought, that the parents used it to torture their children. And the table itself also takes on or mimics a bed. So, in contrast, she felt that the bed was privacy and intimacy. So, whereas the table is sort of torture, the bed is sort of pleasure, and where one pleases their husband and where one eventually will die. Now, her father destroyed that relationship, sort of destroyed that intimacy of the bed in her eyes when he cheated on her mother. So, Freud believed, going back to Freud believed that women hated their mothers and coveted their fathers, just to put it simply. And Louise Bourgeois, she tried to undo that theory with this piece by showing her anger towards her father. But by showing her anger towards her father, she's trying to sort of force him to be loyal in the act of consuming him by having him forever within inside of her. And again, that being said, it sort of reinforces Freudian beliefs, and she's acknowledged that. She's well aware of that sort of contradictive state that's happening within this work. And actually, as she continues into her research into Freud, she looks into hysteria, and she creates a piece for it. And now, if you don't know about hysteria, Freud believed that hysteria was the body's way of releasing sort of pent-up sexual tension from desires that were deemed inappropriate by society. So the body would sort of detach itself in a way, and it would then create this sort of false body part in his beliefs. And the way that he sort of chooses to represent this, or an example that he uses, is that if a woman couldn't walk for an unknown reason and was being aided by her sister's husband, the conclusion would be that she couldn't walk because she subconsciously desired her sister's husband, which is socially unacceptable. But in his attention and touching during the aiding process, because she can't walk, it sort of filled in for her desires in a socially acceptable manner. So because she can't walk, he has to help her. That's socially acceptable. But to covet him, not socially acceptable. And that touching feeling is still present. Now, Louise Bourgeois, she saw this theory, and in response to her past, she created hysterical arch, and sort of mimicking the round features of the body in the pose. And it's supposed to sort of create this change of hard materials into soft and light piece, the past into the present again. And she later will produce other works about her past. Everything that she really does is about her past, but she'll produce the cells, and they're rooms that she creates about her childhood nightmares and sort of her childhood traumas. And again, we see that sort of beginning of the arch of hysteria in the body within this work. And she also produces a work that's called Maman, which is a giant spider, and it's supposed to represent woman and her mother and sort of womanhood, what it means to be a woman, that sort of harshness and fear and everything that goes into it, she puts into this piece. And unfortunately, she passes away at the age of 98 in 2010. So she lived a good long life, but unfortunately she did pass. And a lot of her work still influenced many artists and sort of young female artists of today. Next, we're going to look at Vito Acconci. He was born and raised in the Bronx, New York, and he comes from an Italian immigrant family. And he was raised actually Catholic, and he started as a poet, believe it or not. He was not an artist, he was a poet. And and he later moved into performance art, photography, video art. He dives into land art, audio art, installation art, and even architecture at the end. Now, his works started in the 60s, like Performance Test, but it was the start of what was sort of considered canon of this time for performance art. It very much so explored the body, its limits, its capability, what it does. And what this performance was actually about was he just sat there and stared at each person in the room for 15 seconds. So each person, he made eye contact and he stared at them for 15 seconds. Now, he does a lot of things with his body and sort of that gesture. And in fact, in Blink, he walked down the street and he tried not to blink, but whenever he did, he took a photograph. And the work, what it's actually talking about is it's based on sight, delay, past and present, perspective, and the photographs are sort of a way to look into the past of what he missed out on, and the moments during the blink. So it's sort of this converging of the past and the present and connecting missing memories. And again, he looks at the body when he does the work of push-ups. He documented his imprints in the sand after doing 100 push-ups on the beach. And it was a way of exploring his body within art. Now, as he continues to explore his body within art, his next works tend to be more provocative. I'm just going to warn you right now. And his first piece that we're going to discuss that's more provocative is a trademark, in which case he bit all over his body, on his arms, legs, all different parts, so much that it left a mark, and then he inked the mark and then rubbed it on paper to leave a print. So he printed the bite marks. And this was sort of a commentary on the trade industry of the time and what it meant to have a trademark. So this is his mild piece, dare I say, but his next piece is probably the most discussed. And that is Seedbed. Now, Seedbed, basically he masturbated under a false floor while speaking into a microphone, saying fantasies that he was having about those walking above him. And the people walking above were able to hear it through the speakers in the corners of the room. And the concept was to turn the audience into the object. So he's always been the object. He was the object in trademarks. He was the object in push-ups. He was always the object. It was his body and what his body could do. And here he turns the audience into the object. But while doing so, if the audience accepts the piece, or with the audience acceptance of the piece, it objectifies himself as well as the audience. So he also becomes the object. So it's this play on of who is the object, who is the art piece, what is it about, and sort of introducing more bodies than just his own. And a great example of sort of this connection of the audience's body and their participation is in his next piece, which is Instant House. So the viewer sees these 4 American flags splayed out on the floor on these like wooden house maquettes, like structure, I should say. And as one audience member participates and goes and sits in the swing, it rises for the other audience to see that on the other side is the Soviet flag. So it has to be activated to reveal that part, and it has to be activated by the audience, not the artist, by the audience. So the audience's body is being involved in this again. Now his stance and sort of his political underlying meaning is very ambiguous with this piece. And there's sort of suggestions of whether it's about addressing isolation within America in regards to other countries of this time. Possibly the realization for himself that America is not perfect like people are taught, but rather schools are sort of dictating are manipulating or even sort of hypnotizing in a way, forcing their viewpoints when in actuality the hero and the villain could be anyone or anything. And he makes an audio piece that sort of makes the same commentary on history in the school and how it sort of brainwashes. But this piece, it could be a commentary on that, but it could also be a commentary on the Cold War of the time, which was happening. So there's a lot of underlying meanings within this piece. And a lot of his works have a lot of underlying meanings. And even in his land art, which we're going to see the Face of the Earth 3, and sort of how this jack-o'-lantern-like face within the earth, it's Mother Nature smiling in a way, but it's so creepy and eerie and unsettling, and you're invited to sit in the face. So you can actually sit in the mouth as if Mother Nature is actually devouring you. So there's a lot to be interpreted and a lot to unravel within his works. And it sort of always has this unsettling undertone of creating an uneasy environment and sort of giving the viewer an uneasy feeling. Now, Vito Conchi unfortunately passed away last year, but a lot of his works are very much like Louis Bourgeois. A lot of his works are very much so influential, and particularly his audio pieces. If you have a lot of free time, I suggest actually going and listening to his audio pieces. They're very interesting. They deal with the body in space and whether the body is actually there or not. And the next artist we're going to look at is Ana Mendieta. Now, Ana Mendieta, she came from Havana, Cuba, and she was taken to America at the age of 12 by the CIA's Operation Peter Pan. Now, the Operation Peter Pan was created to help children of families who fell out of political favor during Castro's revolution. So it was only for children. Ana and her sister were the only ones to move to America, and unfortunately they traveled from home to home until finally settling in Iowa, where she will eventually go to the University of Iowa. And this is where we see a lot of her feminist and body art sort of emerge. And in Facial Transplant, a fellow student of hers shaves off his beard and she glues it onto her face. And this is to bring awareness of sort of gender norms, societal expectations, and to show that feminism is not anti-man, as here she works with a man to produce the piece. She also produced a work on male violence and rape by recreating an event that actually happened to a student that she knew on the campus who was raped and killed, and she invited colleagues to visit her apartment at a certain time, which was staged exactly like the crime scene, and she herself was bent over, exposed, and blood smeared on her legs. And Mendieta, she will actually continue to use blood within her works and explore themes of sort of isolation, being uprooted, being a woman, spirituality. And we see this sort of happier tone in blood tracks. Now, originally she smeared the walls with blood in a minimalistic manner. It's two streaks going down the wall. Now, the blood can be suggestive of death and violence, and the performance itself is suggestive of sacrifice and suffering and demise. But when you examine the actual leftover marks of it all and really step back to evaluate it, instead, the viewer sees perhaps life and growth, as the blood also represents life force, and the V shape that she created could be mimicking the growth of a tree. So to Mendieta, blood is not negative, and she refers to it as magical. And in Sweating Blood, we see an ambiguous performance, suggestive of sort of the menstruation or female identity. Martyrdom could be also apparent in this piece, rituals and spirituality, and sort of this leads into her Silueta series, which is probably her most known or most researched works. And it's about sort of the body, but it's not showing the body, it's the absence of the body. Actually, the piece on the right was from an earlier series that eventually leads into this. But the absence of the body in the earth and how this sort of takes on her roots and sort of Mother Nature in general. She examines the environment that influences one's personality and identity. And again, we see a fascination of ritual and spirituality. Mendieta referred to several of these actually as spirits and identified them as sort of a representation of a spirit. Now, unfortunately, Mendieta, she died at a very young age. She fell from her bedroom window, and it is still believed today by many that she was murdered by her boyfriend, but he was never found guilty. So, Mendieta, like other performance artists, she used her body as her medium of art, leading her as not just a feminist artist, but as also a land artist and also involved in the body art movement. But what's really interesting about her works is that she sort of took from this aspect of the female body being an object in art to now being the subject of the art. So she tries to, like how Vito Acconci, he tried to objectify his audience. She tries to bring to light to her audience that she is a female, that she is a human being, which again goes back to her rape piece where she felt as though it was strange to have people just stand there and critique it and evaluate the piece instead of really think about what the traumatic event that unfolded. And the next artist that we're going to look at is Maria Abramović, and she is a performance artist. So she is from former Yugoslavia. And her parents were devout communists who had no faith whatsoever. But her grandparents were devout Orthodox, and they were very religious. And Maria Abramović believed that her upbringing, sort of in this contrasting household, greatly influenced her to be an artist. And she started with just drawings, but finally she eventually moved into performance. And her early performance pieces were very violent. In Rhythm 10, she explored the limitations of the body and sort of converging of the past and present. She had 20 knives before her, and she recorded herself moving as quickly as possible between her fingers with each knife in her hand. And when she would cut herself, she would place the knife down and pick up the next knife and repeat. And she recorded this, and once she cut herself all 20 times with the 20 knives, she then played the recording and started all over again. Now, after this sort of violent streak, she continues to create pieces, but this one in particular is a little bit less violent in the fact that she created the communist star, set it on fire, and then she cut a piece off of her hair, some nails, and she threw it into the fire as sort of this representation of the burning of the past and sort of where you come from. And then she jumped into the center of it and she laid down. Now, because of the fire, she actually passed out. And they eventually, the fire got really close to her and she didn't react at all. And one of the audience members, they said, this isn't right. And they eventually got her out. And she was very angered by this. She was angered by the fact that she had no sort of say in her body and could no longer do anything because she was unconscious. She could no longer perform because she was unconscious. But this inspired her next piece, Rhythm 4. Now, Rhythm 4, she tried to breathe in as much air as possible from an industrial fan. And again, this causes her to lose consciousness, but it's to show the limitations of the lungs and sort of the capacity that her lungs could handle. And this leads into her final rhythm piece, Rhythm 0. And this is probably the most violent, most provocative, most talked about piece that she sort of produces. Maria Abramović, she placed 72 objects on a table, including a gun with a bullet in it. and she invited the audience to use them however way they liked. There was a bottle of glass full of water, and there was a rose, there was rope, there was a lot of different things. But she said that whatever they did, she would take responsibility. Even if they killed her, she took full responsibility. And temporarily, she became an object. And she said that she was an object temporarily. As the act sort of progressed, eventually her clothes were taken off, and an individual eventually did put the gun up to her face, her temple, and this caused a lot of controversy. There was a fight. People tried to get it away. So she did this for 6 hours. That was her time frame. For 6 hours, they could do anything. And at the end of the time frame, she started to walk around and talk with the audience. But a lot of the audience, they ran away. They were unable to confront her now as a human being instead of an object. So a little later on in her life, she meets up with Ollier, who was a German performance artist, and some of the collaborative works that they produce was very much so about the body, but also about their relationship. And in fact, this one is Relation in Space, where they ran into each other naked for an hour, and it was supposedly to combine their energies into one, forming one unit, both male and female, forming one sort of energy that was neither. And again, we see this sort of transfer of energy in breathing in, breathing out, where they would breathe in only each other's exhales. And this piece only lasted for 17 minutes. And it was due to the fact that their lungs filled up with carbon dioxide, making them both pass out. And it was a comment on taking in another's life force and using the body to represent relationships and how they feed off of one another. And that leads to their Recent Energy. That's the name of the piece, Recent Energy. Where they balanced each other using a bow and arrow, with an arrow pointed at Maria Abramovich's heart as a means to represent sort of trust within a relationship. Now, in the late 80s, they do break up, and the way that they break up is actually they walk the wall of China from opposite ends, and they meet in the middle to say goodbye. Now, as her work developed, she created less violent and aggressive pieces, and in 2010, she actually produced a performance piece called The Artist is Present. And for 336 hours and 30 minutes, she sat silently at the MoMA while the audience took turns sitting opposite her, just staring at each other. No words were spoken, they didn't touch, it was just through eye contact. And it's sort of to play on the intensity of silence, the moment of stepping back and looking at a stranger, and sort of taking time out of your day to sort of just sit and think and be in that moment.
And have your attention, please. The museum is now closed. Please return your normal audio program tickets to the desk on the ground floor and collect your belongings.
That is actually Olier, after they haven't seen each other since the Great Wall Walk. So that's going to conclude this week's lecture, and I just want you to sort of um, think about the human body and the drastic change that's happening right now, and how the human body doesn't just become this sort of means of portrayal, means of subject matter, means of an object, but it becomes the physical artwork itself. With performance art, it really shifts and takes this drastic change within art, even with photography. Photography makes a huge change for the art world and the way that it treats and thinks about the body. And land art does the same thing, and all of these movements sort of come together, obviously body art being the most prominent, but all of these movements sort of come together and examine the human body, its senses, its limitations, what it can do, what it can't do, um, sort of its attributes, its sexuality, everything about it. And we're going to look at artists next week that continue on this line.